Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray,
And I'm Chris.
and today we're going to be continuing our six-part series on the Wives of Henry VIII with wife number 3, Jane Seymour. And Chris, this has been probably one of the most interesting group of episodes we've done since we started this podcast, because even though I teach history, I mostly teach American history, and any dealings we have with the royal monarchy of England, which I guess that's two words that don't need to go together, they're one and the same. But when we deal with the monarchy England, you're dealing with King James, you're dealing with Queen Elizabeth, you're dealing with George III, you're dealing with monarchs in England that have direct impact on the United States. And these women, of course, did not.
Yeah, and I think what's beautiful about history is that you can continue to uncover these fascinating stories that might get left out of textbooks and might not be kind of talked about because it's not cool or hip. But when you really start looking at the six wives of Henry VIII, you do find that they were cool, they were hip, they're unique, they're different, and each of them has a part to play. And each one tells some very interesting and powerful stories. And I'm glad that we're kind of letting the world in, if you will, to these women not being seen necessarily as King Henry VIII's wives, but seeing them as individual people who truly make a difference in society. And we do come to wife number 3. You can go back and look at the previous 2 episodes and look at Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. And we come to wife number 3, and really, in wife number 3, who is Jane Seymour. I mean, Ray, you have to say, this is the one out of the 6 that King Henry VIII truly loved.
Yeah, this one is in some ways more of a quote unquote love story, because he seems to really have taken a shine to Jane Seymour. And when we talk in the previous episodes, I think he does, maybe with Anne Boleyn, he has a little affection for her. When we talk about in the next episode, we're going to talk about, Anna Cleves, and there's no affection there. So here with Jane Seymour, you have a lady who he does seem to genuinely love. And when she dies, he genuinely mourns her death. And he might feel a little bit good about it because he's not responsible for her death, but he genuinely mourns her death after she dies. And I think that shows that he did have real feelings for her.
To the point where, she is not as educated as Catherine of Aragon was, or even Anne Boleyn. She's not as pretty as the first 2. I mean, she is considered by other writers who were there during the time she was pale. She was of middling stature. There wasn't a whole lot of beauty, but yet she was the fairest of all the king's wives. And if you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, we'll kind of get to the end of the story and then we'll come back. Many people will say, oh, well, the reason that he loved her is because she gave him what wife number 1 and wife number 2 couldn't give him, which was the only thing he wanted in all of the world, which was to have a male heir, somebody that would continue his dynasty, his legacy on. And Jane Seymour is able to provide that for him. But, I think if you look at the whole, as you say, pseudo love story, I think that there was more to it than just the son. I think that there was a true bond, a relationship. They had a lot in common, if you will, and he was drawn to her.
Yeah, he was. And she was from a very important family. Her father, or she comes, she's from the Seymour family. And if you study the Tudors and Henry VIII and Edward VI, the name Seymour pops up quite a bit. So she is from a prominent family there in the kingdom. She's a lady in waiting for Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, and then she becomes a lady in waiting for Anne Boleyn. And then, of course, she catches Henry's eye, she catches Henry's attention, and she becomes queen herself. Now, as you said, she maybe wasn't, in some ways, I guess, the typical looking person that might have caught the king's attention. But, she definitely did. And I think it's like 1536, word starts floating around that King Henry's in a new relationship.
Yeah, and
he hadn't changed. I guess that's when he changed his Facebook profile.
Yes, and let's just be honest. He changes that profile, and he is engaged to be married to her the day after wife number 2 is executed. So
yeah.
It's, I mean, it's not like he spent a lot of time in mourning with Anne. He jumped right in, and I do find that interesting that we have Jane being around in the court for the previous 2 wives. So I don't know if he just caught her eye, or he caught her eye, whatever, so late in the game, because she's been around. So basically how it worked in the palace is that the king, he knew the ladies in waiting. He was very familiar with all of them. Actually, we know this because Anne Boleyn, who was a lady in waiting, kind of made her way into the arms of King Henry VIII, just like Jane Seymour is going to make. And I think one thing that really maybe wins over King Henry VIII is that she is loved by the community. And that's something that the king needed. He needed somebody that was going to be his queen, his wife, that moved in approval with the common people of England. And some people will say, well, she was supportive, or she was supported by the people because of her looks. She was supported by the people because she was not that educated. She was supported by the people because she was compassionate. Some of those different things is kind of how they could see, because when Jane becomes queen, she gets rid of all the extravagance. She throws away all of the parties and the festivities that had been pretty popular in Anne Boleyn's time. And she is basically conservative. And I think people wanted that. I mean, we still see a big role religions playing in this, with the struggle between Catholic and Protestant. Henry VIII has claimed his own church, basically, and he's kind of been moving in that direction. And here is Jane Seymour, who comes in, and she gets rid of all the wild stuff that is going on as well. And I think that might have played a role in it also.
And Jane was, and I think Henry as well, they were both more cautious about getting this out in public and making things official. She was certainly more happy to maybe remain behind the scenes a little bit and sort of let things play out a little bit more slowly, in some ways, than maybe Anne Boleyn was. And if you remember from our previous episode on Anne Boleyn, she was not a popular person with the British public. The public continued to consider Catherine Aragon to be queen. In fact, Catherine, as you know, continued to claim to be queen. She refused to hand back her crown. Now, she's going to die in January, early January of 1536. When all of this is going on, when Henry is first sort of moving in with Jane Seymour and making those initial contacts between the two in this sense. So they're a little bit more cautious, and I think Jane is more happy to be sort of let things move naturally than to try to rush things.
Yeah, it's stated that her quote, or her motto, if you will, was bound to obey and serve. That she just basically wanted to be in the shadows, except she demonstrated extreme sympathy for Catherine, the wife number 1, and especially for the daughter Mary. And people can go back and review the previous episodes when basically King Henry, after he falls in love, if we want to use that term with Anne Boleyn, he kicks Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, out and out of the royal house. And so one of the things that you find Jane doing is basically coming in and saying, hey, she has no role in all that has taken place between the adults in the group here. Let's show some love for Mary. And she basically is one who kind of restores a relationship with Henry and with Mary. It doesn't really get her into a line of succession, if you will, but it does kind of bring back father and daughter, which that says a lot. Once again, I think that drew warmth and affection from the English people as well.
Yeah, and it's around this same time, the same year, 1536, that Henry gets some very bad news. His only son, who is illegitimate, his only son, Henry Fitzroy, dies. Now, at this point, to put sort of, you're talking about Mary, to put it in context at this point, Henry Fitzroy was illegitimate. He was in the sense that Henry was not married to his mother. But Mary and Elizabeth were now considered illegitimate as well, since Mary's mother was no longer queen and now was dead. And Elizabeth's mother was executed, charged with treason. So all of his children at this point are considered illegitimate. So the pressure is on Jane Seymour, not just simply to produce an heir, but produce a male heir. Because right now, I guess Mary's probably in line to some degree, but she is, not looked on very favorably. So the pressure's on Jane Seymour to give King Henry VIII what he so desperately wants, and that is a male heir. And
I think something to be said about that is that's what he wants. And it is interesting is that they get married in 1536, but what happens is that she's never crowned queen.
Right.
And there's a reason for that. There's two reasons. One of the reasons is she's not crowned because of the Great Plague that takes place in London, and they can't go back to kind of like COVID. Everything's shut down, quarantine, and so they're unable to have a ceremony, and she's not able to be the coronation to take place. That's a legitimate reason. The other reason that could have been there is the fact that Henry, after wife number 2 has failed him in his ultimate quest, and wife number 2 has failed him also, he might be thinking, hey, I'm not going to crown her queen until she proves herself and she gives me what I want, which is a male heir to the throne. So I think that is interesting. Now it could have been, it was simply because of the plague, but I think that Henry would have welcomed that, because at this point he doesn't have to say, well, she's a queen, and once again, she's failed me if she doesn't bear a son.
Yeah. And when it is confirmed that she is with child, that Jane Seymour is pregnant, there are celebrations throughout the land, because this could be it. This could be the moment that not just simply Henry VIII, but also the larger nation had been waiting for. And it was confirmed October 12, 1536, that baby was born, and that baby's name was Edward. Henry VIII finally got his male heir.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that during her time of expecting, that he pretty much locked her down. Yeah. He made sure that, I'm going to do this one right. So he supplied her with everything that she needed. He brought in the best doctors. He basically just kind of shut her off and said, I need you to do everything right in this period before the baby comes, so that we don't lose the child. And I just think that it just shows his fascination with getting this male heir, that he just basically says, do what the doctors say for 9 months. And then, she gives birth. But Ray, that birth that she gives, yes, she gives him an heir, but she endures a very difficult labor. I mean, 2 days, 3 nights. I mean, some say that the baby was not well positioned, and there's a lot of discussion as to whether she had a C-section or, if she gave a natural birth. But what we know is that giving a baby boy to Henry VIII was extremely difficult and could have been deathly.
And it ultimately did result in her death just 12 days later. 12 days. Edward's born on October 12. She dies on October 24. Talk a little bit about Edward, Chris. He's the male heir that Henry VIII had been waiting 29, 30 years for. Now he's got him. Of course, when Henry VIII dies, young Edward, still a child, I think he's 8, 9 years old, is going to become King Edward VI of England. And unfortunately, he's going to die of what they call consumption or tuberculosis as a teenager. And that's when you have Mary I becoming queen. And speaking of Mary, both Mary and Elizabeth are at the christening that Henry VIII has for his new son. And you got to just imagine Henry sitting there just beaming with joy. I almost said beaming with pride, but it was probably more pride in himself than anything else. Beaming with joy. He now has this son he is so proud of, and he's so wanted this heir. He had this for so long. Mary, his daughter from Catherine of Aragon, is announced to be Edward's godmother. Elizabeth is there, his daughter from his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Sorry, almost choked. Anne Boleyn is there, and she, interestingly enough, is with, at this particular point, she's still a little girl, but she is with Thomas Seymour. And years later, Thomas Seymour is actually going to try to marry Elizabeth. That sort of gets in. If our listeners go back to our episodes on President Grover Cleveland, and we talk about his young wife and how he knew her since she was a little child, it's a similar type thing. But now he has this heir, and then he loses, like we've already said, he loses Jane Seymour, and there's all sorts of rumors about what happened. Did he, quote, rip the baby out of her womb through a C-section, or was it natural birth? I think it probably was a natural birth. And I think it was just her body just simply couldn't handle the struggle of it.
Yeah, and it's extremely sad. She was able to witness, if you will, the christening of the son, and yet very quickly after that, she dies. And it is at that moment that I think a part of King Henry dies as well. Yes, he's beaming with pride. He's excited over the birth of a son, but this wife, this woman, who had given him exactly what he wanted, who had done so with very little trouble. Remember, her motto was bound to obey and serve. She had stayed in the background. She had not caused a ruckus. She had not been, she had just been Jane. And yet here he has received this boy, but he has also lost his wife. And to prove to the world, I guess, if you look back on this, that she will be the only one of Henry's wives that will actually receive a queen's funeral, to the point that she is actually buried in the tomb that had been created for King Henry himself. And for the next 3 months, Henry wears black. He's mourning. He's lost. And as we've already talked about with the previous 3, you get married the next day, you get married 2 months from now, it's going to be a long dry spell for Henry. A lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the main reasons is he lost his true love, and I think it did pain him. We look at Henry VIII as this cruel, mean, just jerk kind of a guy, but I think in a moment right here, there is a soft spot that we start to see in Henry VIII that he really did mourn.
Yeah, and it's very sad. You mentioned earlier on that Jane Seymour tried to sort of act as a between Henry VIII and his daughter Mary, and you see that Mary really appreciated that, and that at Jane Seymour's funeral, she is the chief mourner. So you see that Jane Seymour was not just queen, not just a woman who gave Henry VIII his only male heir, not just a woman who didn't really care for all the pomp and circumstance of her office, but a woman who tried to do good things in a very difficult situation. Because no doubt, if you know the politics and the drama of that period, it was not an easy environment for anyone. But she tried to do, I think, the right thing, and unfortunately, the birth of Edward was just simply too much, and she succumbed shortly thereafter. So,
yeah, I think it is an interesting story, because we know there's going to be 6 wives. We find ourselves at wife number 3, and you have to wonder about history changing and what would have happened if Jane had survived the birth of Edward. What would have happened? It's just one of those what ifs that we'll never know, but you just wonder, because all of history, especially in American history and things of that nature, is going to play a part in English history, because of the results of Henry VIII, and then get into Edward and all these other characters. So it is curious what would have happened.
If she had survived and remained in good relationship with Henry VIII, I guess when he died, she would have become queen, correct? And
Absolutely.
that means Edward wouldn't have become king at that time.
Right.
So anyway, who knows what would have happened. Chris, another great episode of the podcast. I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. Please like us on Spotify, leave a comment, share the podcast with your family and friends, and come back as we continue to look at the wives of Henry VIII. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.